Welcome to the Gaggle, where we challenge and, if necessary, destroy media narratives. I'm George Samuel. It is now 9:06 p.m. in a very cold, grim, dark, sunless, lightless, uh, spiritless city of Central Europe in Budapest. Really, today was just one of the bleakest days in a long time, and that's saying something. But everybody, welcome to the Thursday night live stream. Night, of course, but it's only 3:07 p.m. on the East Coast, and it's lunchtime on the West Coast. Anyway, welcome everybody who has joined me. Really appreciate your being here. And before we get on to the, obviously the issues that interest us, namely Trump's interesting diplomacy. I should note that today is the 80th anniversary of the Red Army's liberation of Budapest. Um, the liberation of Budapest, and indeed the fighting in Budapest, has not really been noted very much in the history books. I mean, the history books obviously write a great deal about the Battle of Stalingrad. They could talk about the battle for Berlin, but comparatively little has been written about what happened in Budapest. Um, Hungary, as you know, had been an ally of Hitler's, and it and being in good standing with Nazi Germany. Um, Hitler had twice revised the Treaty of Trianon, giving Hungary some of the territory, not all of it, some of the territory that it had lost through the Treaty of Trianon, some of Slovakia, and some of Romania. But since Slovakia and Romania were both allies of Hitler's, Hitler couldn't really very well just take all the territory away from them. So he gave Hungary a slice, but it was still better than nothing. And so the Hungarian gratitude was aligned with Hitler, but the thing was that that Horthy, the regent, he was the regent. He was in waiting for the return of the Habsburg king, which was never going to happen because there was an attempt by the Habsburg pretender to take the throne in Hungary in 1922, but this was flatly ruled out by the Allied powers. So it was never going. The return of the Habsburgs was not going to happen. But nonetheless, Horthy was in waiting for that. But Hungary was very, very rabidly anti-Soviet, really, really hated the Soviet Union. I mean, in part, this was in reaction to the communist dictatorship, the Hungarian Soviet Republic that was established in 1919, which lasted 133 days, and which I've talked about before, which my great uncle was one of its leaders. But the reaction against that the communist dictatorship was intense, and it led to an absolutely an ideology of rabid anti-Sovietism in Hungary. So in 1941, when Hitler invaded the Soviet Union, Hungary, without really needing to do so, joined this invasion. So Hungary was one of the in countries that invaded the Soviet Union in June of 1941, and Hungary suffered severe casualties. I mean, Hungary had fought at the Battle of Stalingrad and suffered considerably. Romanians also fought at the Battle of Stalingrad and suffered considerably. But the problem was that Horthy kind of, by 1943, he was already thinking that he needed to get out of this war. I mean, figured that Germany was going to lose this war, and he sort of started making nice. He was making nice with the Allied, with the British and the Americans, but he was also making nice with Stalin. And with Stalin, it was quite interesting because in 1943, Hungary did an exchange with the Soviet Union. So the communists who were imprisoned in Hungary, including the communist leader that became very famous, Matyas Rákosi, were released and handed over to the Soviet Union. And in return, the Soviet Union handed back to the Hungarian government, the Horthy government, regimental flags that it had seized in 1849. So remember, there was the Hungarians rose up against the Austrian rule in 1848. The Hungarians had defeated the Austrians, and the Austrians, not knowing what to do, invoked the Holy Alliance with Russia, and said, to the Russians, well, please help us out. We can't manage the Hungarians on our own. And so the Russians, in the spirit, as always, the Russians, in this selfless way, went ahead and said, sure, in the spirit of our Holy Alliance, we will help you deal with the Hungarians. And they sent their forces in and indeed crushed the Hungarians in 1849, executed the leaders of the 1848 uprising. And of course, Austria, as always happens with the Russians, then promptly betrayed the Russians by not supporting Russia during the Crimean War a few years later, in 1853. That is always the what happens with Russia. We were led by the nose. It's a sort of early version of we were led by the nose. But anyway, while they were crushing the Hungarians in 1849, they seized these regimental flags. And as a great favor to the Hungarian, Stalin offered to return the regimental flags in return for the release of the communists. And so they did this exchange. This was in 1943. Rákosi, Gerő, they went to the Soviet Union then in 1943. Even though Hungary, was aligned with the Axis powers. Hungary had invaded the Soviet Union, was still fighting on Soviet territory. Nonetheless, they did this goodwill exchange. My father, who was obviously was young at the time, he was living in the Soviet Union, and because he was the nephew of the famous Hungarian communist, so he was kind of communist aristocracy, so to speak, in the Soviet Union. But he was there in Moscow at the train station when they greeted the returning Hungarian communists, the Hungarian communists who had arrived. But anyway, this was part of this Horthy's attempt to get himself out of this war. Now, the problem that so he was making these pitches to the Soviets, he was making pitches to the British and the Americans, and the problem was, of course, that Hitler got wind of this, and this kind of really annoyed him, as these things were wont to do. And in March 1944, Germany invaded Hungary. So up until then, Hungary had been an ally of Germany's, but was not under German occupation. So, but now, March 1944, Hungary is now invaded by Germany, and and this is where the things got very nasty, because of course then Adolf Eichmann arrived in Budapest, set himself up in Budapest, and then began the mass deportation of the Jews to Auschwitz. Horthy remained in power during this time, so Horthy did not step down following the German invasion. Um, but then after the collapse of Romania, because Romania switched sides, so basically the German position then became unsustainable in Romania, and the Red Army swept through Romania and then entered Hungary. Horthy, I think on October the 15th, 1944, then made a broadcast and said, "We're leaving the war, we're getting out," and ordered Hungarian units to stop fighting. Basically, stop fighting the Red Army. Basically, that's it. Stop doing it. Well, obviously, the Germans really weren't very happy with this. So they brought in this Scorsese, famous Scorsese, the guy who rescued Mussolini in 1943 after he was overthrown, and then Hitler installed Mussolini in that little statelet in northern Italy, that Salo. Anyway, so Scorsese came in, kidnapped Horthy's son, and Horthy himself was then removed to Germany, and then that was a moment in which the Arrow Cross, the Hungarian fascists, really took over the country. So that was about October 1944. That's when the Arrow Cross took over in Hungary, and then they made an absolute fight of it. They fought with great ferocity against the Red Army. So this went on for 3 months till February 1944, before finally Budapest was destroyed and taken by the Red Army. Huge losses on the side of the Russians, and this was quite a remarkable thing. And of course, one of the interesting events that took place were interesting in subsequent years, because in subsequent years there was a whole story about Raoul Wallenberg and whatever happened to Wallenberg, because Wallenberg he was a Swedish diplomat. He was based in Hungary, but he was working for the Americans. He was working for the OSS, and this was all part of the general kind of maneuvering, but first on the part of the Hungarians trying to get out of the war. But of course, it was always also about maneuvering on the part of the Western powers and trying to secure Hungary for the future, as a kind of a Western Essay just says, but George, did Eichmann really set himself up, or wasn't he just a functionary? Yeah, he was. I mean, I just said set himself up because he set himself up in Grand Hotel Budapest, where he did his planning of the mass deportations. But what happened exactly to Wallenberg is not entirely clear. Clearly, he was arrested by the Soviets. They saw him as a spy for the Americans, and whether they executed him there in Hungary, whether they took him back to Moscow, executed him in Moscow, or they say he died in somewhere or other, in some prison somewhere or other. Nobody exactly knows. The strange thing was that nobody really cared about this until this became a cause célèbre many years later. There's this constant talk about what happened to Wallenberg. What did the Soviets do to Wallenberg? But at the time, it was nobody really thought, because why would it matter? It was just one more person who was killed. I mean, one more person actually suspected of working for the other side, and he was in the way, right? Wrong place at the wrong time. The Soviets were playing for keeps. They intended to keep Hungary after World War II, and they saw Wallenberg as working for the Americans, and got him out of the way. The what I think is interesting is that two things are interesting. First, the Hungarians never really have never really come to terms with the fact that they launched an unprovoked attack on the Soviet Union. There was no reason for them to invade the Soviet Union in June 1941. The Soviet Union hadn't done anything to them, and the only grievance the Hungarians had at the time was the Treaty of Trianon, where Hungary lost 2/3 of its the territory. But the Soviet Union had nothing to do with Trianon. I mean, if you're upset that you lost all this territory to Romania and Slovakia, Romania and Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia, then take it up with the British and the French. I mean, the Soviet Union were out; they were completely isolated. They had nothing to do with any of the diplomatic negotiations after World War I, with any of the treaties that. Gary Hines says, George, did Béla Kun not work for the Russians? Well, that's a very interesting question you ask. Béla Kun, obviously, Kun, my great uncle, and the key figures in the Hungarian Soviet Republic had been prisoners of war that fought in the army of Austria-Hungary. They'd been captured by the Russians. They were prisoners of war in Russia, and in the turmoil of the revolution in 1917, they completely went over to the communists. Many of them had no real political interest before then, which of course, and they paid the price for that. Their lack of political experience, I think, was one of the reasons why, one of the reasons for the failure of the Hungarian Soviet Republic. But they were there. They were in Russia, took part in the revolution. Brutal, ruthless. Particularly Kun. Kun was very ruthless in his activities in Crimea in 1918. And then they were sent back to Hungary, obviously to bring communism to Hungary. But the question that you asked, well, wasn't he working for the Russians? In a way, he was. Obviously, I mean, they're on the same side. They're all trying to effect a world revolution. But Hungary was far from the Soviet Union, and Lenin couldn't really do anything for them. I mean, he was the Soviet Union, Russia at the time. The remnants of the Russian Empire were embroiled in a ferocious civil war. I mean, Lenin just didn't have any forces to spare to send to Hungary. So Hungary was really left on its own to fight off the Romanians, the Czechoslovaks, but above all, the Entente powers, because the Entente powers had no intention of allowing a communist dictatorship in Hungary. But so they were trying to, they didn't want to directly invade Hungary. Because that would be problematic, and they didn't know how that would go down domestically. But they were absolutely determined to crush the Hungarian Soviet Republic. So they tried to do it through negotiations, which they eventually did. They negotiated the departure of the members of the the Soviet Republic, and they left for Vienna, including my great uncle. But my great uncle, because he was so much associated with the terror, he wasn't given asylum by the Austrian authorities. Obviously, that was arranged with the Austrians and the Entente powers, and so he was arrested and committed suicide at the border. But the rest of them, they made into Austria. They went to Germany. Many of them then ended up in the Soviet Union, and many of them, including Béla, were executed by Stalin during the purges of the 1930s. The ones who, like Rákosi, the future Hungarian communist leaders, because they were based in Hungary, they didn't get to the Soviet Union until much later. They were safe. They managed to avoid being in Moscow during the 1930s. So I know if people want to get onto the really interesting issues about Trump and Putin, which we'll get to. I'll just finish off about this. So what I was saying is that the Hungarians today have deep hatred for the communist era, the era of the 40 years of communism, and there's some hostility, resentment, and hatred for the Russians as a result of that. The problem is, obviously, the communism was not nice. It was not a happy time. On the other hand, you have to say, though, that if you start a war and you lose a war, you pay a price. Hungary paid a price. Now, would it have made any difference if they hadn't invaded the Soviet Union? After Czechoslovakia suffered the same fate, and Czechoslovakia didn't invade the Soviet Union. But geography is what it is, and given the march of the Red Army, there really wasn't much prospect of Hungary breaking free. And it's understandable people may have resentments about the 40 years of communism, which incidentally was much more civilized and tolerable and tolerant than the communist regimes in Eastern Europe at the same time. But you still do have to take responsibility for being on the wrong side of a war and having invaded the Soviet Union. So you were going to pay a price. So that's one thing. The other thing is that, however, that the Hungarians have managed, unlike the other countries of Eastern Europe, they've managed not to maintain this animosity towards the Russians. They don't desecrate the war memorials. They don't desecrate the military cemeteries. They're all there. All the memorials to the liberating Red Army, all to the Soviet heroes. They're all there. Boom. They're right in the center of the city. You see it. And so on. They haven't done any. They haven't moved them out, and they're there. They're kept up. They're cleaned, and no one ever throws paint at them or try to do any damage to them. So the Hungarians have managed to go beyond the constant picking at scabs and regurgitating grievances that other East European states continue to engage in. And it's very interesting that the Western powers are very angry at the Hungarians for not doing so. I mean, I don't know how many articles that I've read in the New York Times when they are continually pointing out that Orban maintains good relations with Putin. Well, this is a disgrace. I mean, does he not realize what the Russians did in 1956 when they crushed the Hungarian people's search for freedom? Does he not realize what the Russians did in 1849 when again they crushed the Hungarians? How can you not think about this? You see how the Western powers are constantly trying to energize, pump oxygen into all the old grievances, always playing off countries against one another, and making everybody resentful and hate-filled towards the Russians. But Hungary has avoided that. I mean, Viktor Orban obviously has played a role in that. But you have to wonder, though, if he if he had if he were removed from power, if he loses an election and one of the liberals take over, whether that policy would change. But anyway, I mean, I can see from the comments that enough of all this stuff. Let's get on to Trump and Putin. All right, so let's talk about Trump and Putin and Pete Hegseth. So now, I guess I would, distance myself from most of the enthusiastic commentary. I mean, I'm obviously enthusiastic in the fact that the phone call took place. I was obviously very warm on both sides. There's talk about immediate negotiations, at high-level negotiations. I mean, Trump has put together, a high-level team. I mean, that it involves the vice president, it involves the Secretary of State, it involves his CIA director. So they're all going to be involved in this in the negotiations with the Russians. Strikingly, it doesn't involve Keith Kellogg. I mean, Kellogg, I'm not sure now what Keith Kellogg's role in anything is. I mean, he's not involved in these negotiations. But there is clearly, I mean, Trump has invited Putin to come to the United States. Putin invited Trump to come to the United States. That was an amazing development. And then, this does look like a summit will take place in Saudi Arabia. So this is all absolutely positive. The problem that I see is that, well, that's nice, and it's all fine, on a personal level, and it's the change of tone is refreshing. It's a very different from the hysterical, moralistic, self-righteous, apocalyptic tone from the Biden administration and from all the NATO governments. Much of what we heard yesterday and today. But where do we get from here? I mean, how do we get to anything now? I mean, there are two aspects of any future negotiations, and both of them have to be addressed. I mean, there's the aspect of what happens in the four oblasts. If Russia had won and decisively had driven out the Ukrainian armed forces from the four oblasts, that problem would at least be easily resolvable, because then you can say, well, okay, well, let's recognize the or not recognize, but let's just accept this is the demarcation zone. This is the line of contact. We don't want to go on fighting. Let's just call it a day at where it is now. We will not accept, obviously, the incorporation of these territories into Russia, but at least we can stop the fighting. If Russia had done that, if Russia had managed to drive the Ukrainian forces from those oblasts, at least that problem would be relatively soluble, because clearly Trump wants to bring this to an end. So the people who are continually saying, again, for Xenon, They say Russia will never accept anything. Russia will not negotiate. Russia will just go on and it will march on to victory and it will just go on, crush all, before it, and it's just, no negotiation. We're not going to accept any peace terms put down by Trump. Nothing. We're not going to accept it. Well, the problem that's arisen is that Russia hasn't done it. I mean, if Russia had managed to at least secure the oblast, then we could say, okay, well, boom. I mean, let's then have a ceasefire, and for the time being, who knows for how long, years, decades, forever, the oblasts are not a part of Ukraine; they're part of the Russian Federation. We don't accept it, but at least it's a basis for it. But Russia hasn't done it. So what happens now? Because Russia can't expect Trump to hand. I mean, Putin in June of last year had said, "Well, what are the conditions for a ceasefire?" So, well, if you want a ceasefire, you can get a ceasefire if you withdraw from the four oblasts and you forswear forever joining NATO. And of course, demilitarization and so on. So that was said. Okay, you want a ceasefire? Those are the conditions we give you for the ceasefire. But at the moment, he's only occupying 60% of Donetsk, something like maybe 70% of Zaporozhye, and maybe about 70% of Kherson. So he's got a big job ahead of him. I mean, Donetsk, he's still got all of the big strategic targets to secure in Donetsk. I mean, he's still got to take Pokrovsk, he's got to take Chasiv Yar, but even that's only just the beginning, because he's still got to take Slavyansk and Kramatorsk. So it's still a big project for it, and Trump isn't going to deliver for it. I mean, why should he? I mean, if you're Trump and say, well, you haven't secured it, well, why should I give it to you? So if Russia is determined to secure the four oblasts, make those four oblasts in part of the Russian Federation, but it's still a long way from it. Meg Galucci asks, why is George not mentioning the referendums? It seems to me that they are legal under the UN Charter. Well, the problem with that is that they're not going to recognize a referendum in principle is, that it's something, but then the UN and no one's going to recognize the validity of the referendums. They'll just say, hey, well, they weren't conducted under proper conditions. A lot of people weren't able to vote, and so on. Now, I mean, Meg raises an interesting question. I mean, what if they decided upon, okay, well, let's have a referendum. Let's have legally guaranteed referendums, under UN supervision and under UN observers and whatnot, and then those referendums would be binding. I don't know how that would go, to be honest, because the Western powers would cheat like mad in any referendum. They would start moving populations there. Oh yeah, this person is there. He's lived there all his life. They're gonna move into those areas all sorts of people who will definitely vote against the Russian authorities. But it's a very good question. I mean, then whether Russia would then have to say that the referendums that they conducted are not valid, because the referendums that the Russians conducted nobody will recognize other than the Russians. I mean, the Western powers are not going to accept the outcome of those referendums. They might, it's possible, say, accept the outcome of referendums held under, some kind of fair and whatever UN, OSCE mandated conditions. But I'm not sure if I were the Russians, can I be sure that they will be properly held, and that the Western powers are not going to cheat like mad? They've cheated like mad in referendums in the past. But certainly, the first step would have to be that the Russians would lift their recognition of the referendums that they had held, and said we need new referendums, because those referendums would not be accepted by the Western powers. In which case, the fighting would go on. But in any case, the problem from Russia's point of view is that they don't have it. They don't. It's not. It's the four oblasts are not under their control. So, which again makes the whole referendum thing a bit dubious. And if Russia were to accept somehow a ceasefire and an armistice, Meg says yes, hold them again. Okay, well, we can do it. I mean, it be again. Who knows what the outcome would be, and whether the Western powers would go for it. But in principle, I mean, I think that's an interesting suggestion. I just don't think that the West would go for it. It's a very dangerous thing to do. I mean, holding referendums, and then and then that would determine secession. Remember, even in the case of Kosovo, the Western powers didn't go for it, even though they would have won in Kosovo. They would have won the referendum in Kosovo, but they didn't. They didn't want to hold a referendum there. They didn't want to establish the principle of a referendum. But anyway, I mean, that would certainly be one of the options to that might come up in any negotiations, whether you can have a referendum, and whether the results of the referendum would be binding. I absolutely have a real doubt that the Western powers would accept, say, oh, this is binding, and therefore, if the oblasts vote to leave Ukraine, they can leave Ukraine, because then all sorts of people are going to say, yeah, well, what about us? We want to have a referendum, and you need to recognize us as having a binding, character. In other words, I mean, Transnistria said, we want a referendum. We want to leave Moldova, and straight out of the bloc will be the Respublika, Respublika Srpska in Bosnia and Herzegovina. Said, yeah, we want a referendum. We want out from Bosnia and Herzegovina. And of course, then you have all the other entities. You've got the Transcarpathia also will say, yeah, we want a referendum. We want to join Hungary, and so on. So I think that's the reason why the Western powers would be very loath to hold a referendum. I mean, they could say, and they've done this before, say, well, this is a sui generis, never to be repeated by anyone else. Meg says Hungary should get its land back, Romania, Poland too. Yeah, I think that's I think it's certainly an argument, but I think that's why I think the Western powers would be very loath to hold a referendum, and then think that now they just, they've opened the Pandora's box, so everybody holding referendums and deciding where they want to go. Um, and to be fair, the Russians really never wanted to do it to begin with. I mean, the Russians, after the breakup of the Soviet Union, had accepted the borders of the former republics of the USSR as their international frontiers. They didn't really want to go down the path of holding referendums and breaking states up. So it was just because of all the things that happened in Ukraine that they suddenly decided to go for this policy of a referendum. But okay, I mean, Meg, I think you raise a good point, and that could be something that will come up in any future negotiations. You say, okay, well, why not try and settle this by a referendum? And but nevertheless, as things stand, since basically there's a war on, there's fighting taking place. Russia's objectives. I mean, Russia has these two objectives. This is what I was saying. There's basically two things that have to be resolved in any negotiations, which is one is these oblasts, which Russia has now said they are part of the Russian Federation. If the fighting just simply stops, and then you have some of it's in Russia, some of it's in Ukraine, then I think it just becomes really, really complicated how these oblasts can be run, with one part of it here and another part of it in another country. I mean, I guess you could get around it, but it would be so fraught with difficulties, so liable for to constant antagonism and conflict that it would almost certainly lead to an outbreak of fighting. If this 70% of Donetsk is in the Russian Federation and the rest of it is part of Ukraine. I mean, it's just asking for a resumption of fighting. Meg says, yeah, well, that was stupid because Ukraine was never a country, except for a brief period. You're absolutely right. I mean, that all that the Bolsheviks did many stupid things, and the problem was that they didn't think that state would disintegrate. So they kind of created these very crazy entities, and think, well, okay, it doesn't matter so long as we're all part of one state, and therefore it doesn't matter whether this part of it is in Ukraine, this part of it is in Russia, because it's one country. The problem that arose was that it broke up. So when Khrushchev handed Crimea over to Ukraine in 1954, he said, "Well, what does it matter? I mean, it's the one country. I mean, it's the USSR, so it doesn't matter whether it's being administered by the Soviet Republic of Ukraine or whether it's administered by the Soviet Republic of Russia, because it's still one country." But of course, it did matter a great deal once it broke up. But you're right. I mean, what the Bolsheviks did was to play off all these different nationalities against one another. I mean, they pursued the policy of divide and rule. So they were perfectly happy. And, you stuff all these national minorities into one republic, and then, okay, they all hate one another. And that means, well, it's great, because then they're too busy hating one another to focus on their energies on hating the central government. So that I think that was a Bolshevik strategy. So you're right, yeah, Ukraine wasn't really a country. Um, and but once it broke up, the Russians really didn't do very much. I mean, you're saying it was stupid, and they should have absolutely dealt with these problems right away. But the difficulty that they had was that Russia was instrumental in breaking up the USSR. It was Russia that broke it up. So it wasn't just all republics seceded. If republics had seceded from the USSR, then the problem would have been easy to deal with, because then essentially Russia could have just made life very, very miserable for any seceding republic. It would have, basically carved out bits and pieces out of each republic and say, well, you can't have this. This stays in the Soviet Union, and you can't have these industries because they belong to us, so that's gone. Oh, and you owe us a lot of money because because there's the national debt, and you owe us money for the debt. You owe us for all the investment that we've made in your country, and these, you can't have this part of the country because that was this minority, they hate you, so that you can't walk off with them. They could have done it. They could have made life very difficult for any seceding republic. But what happened was that at Belovezh, Russia, Ukraine, so Yeltsin, Kravchuk, and the guy who was running Belarus at the time, I always forget his name. I mean, it wasn't Lukashenko, it was the guy who preceded Lukashenko. So the three of them went ahead and just dissolved the USSR. Now, of course, they had no legal basis for dissolving the USSR. That was just, they had no legal basis whatsoever. I mean, there were all kinds of mechanisms in place for any republic to secede, but it was a complicated constitutional procedure that you had to go through in order to secede from the USSR. But you can't just simply get together, over a boozy dinner, and then decide that well, we're just dissolving our country, and the rest of you, you just make your own way. But that's why Russia's been in a difficult position, that since the dissolution of the USSR, because it was Russia that dissolved it. Unlike in the case of Yugoslavia, where you had the republics that illegally seceded, and Serbia remained, or at least it insisted upon being respected as the core Yugoslavia, the core Yugoslavia that remained after the secessions. But of course, Serbia was just too small and weak to insist successfully on being treated as the core remnant of Yugoslavia, and that's why the Western powers said, no, you are not the successor state to Yugoslavia. You are just one of the successor states. You're no different from anyone else. They could do it in the case of Serbia, but they can't. They couldn't do it in the case of Russia. But the problem with Ukraine arose because of Belovezh. I mean, they Yeltsin went ahead. He signed this deal with Ukraine and with Belarus, and all of the issues about Crimea, about the Donbass, everything else was just left out. We're not going to bother, because so intent was Yeltsin in order to win this political battle that he was waging against Gorbachev, that he didn't care. He absolutely didn't care what happened to the Russians who were in Ukraine. And so they were basically just putting this off, all these problems off, for another day. But eventually they would have to be dealt with, and particularly in the case of Crimea, what the people of Crimea several times made an attempt to leave the Ukraine. They said, we don't want to be a part of Ukraine. We want to join Russia, and when they threatened to hold a referendum, Ukraine threatened to use force. And of course, the Western powers were thoroughly and eager to support the Ukraine's use of force against Crimea. But anyway, so the thing was, again, so we got the issue. First of all, you have to resolve will be the 4 oblasts, which, as I say, what makes it very difficult is that Russia just isn't in full control of it. But then there's the other issue, which is the some kind of a security conference. What Russians are looking for, this kind of Helsinki 2.0, so that somehow Russia's security needs, all Russia's security concerns will be respected. The difficulty with that, I mean, is that, I think Trump would be sympathetic to something like that. Yeah, let's have a big conference and let's hammer out some vague set of principles to guide our future relations. He'll say, yeah, that's sure, let's do that. But the difficulty is that the Europeans are not going to go for it. Now, one could say, well, what does it matter what the Europeans? Europeans are just simply, they're just weak sisters. It doesn't matter, and that's partly true. But if they're not prepared to take part in any such security architecture, security conference, then there's nothing much that can be done. So even though they don't have much of a force relative to what the United States has, they can absolutely just refuse to go along with any kind of a security partnership with Russia. And I think that's one of the interesting developments in the contemporary Europe, which I think different from the days of détente, which is that it's the Europeans, and particularly the Baltic states and Poland, but also the Czech Republic and Romania, the UK, Germany, even, they're absolutely rabidly against the Russians. They're absolutely crazy in their hatred, and that, in a way, it's quite dangerous because you kind of there's a point at which the hatred just spills over into actual fighting. I mean, when you look at these Baltic states, this horrific creature, Kaja Kallas, the former Estonian prime minister, I mean, they want a war with Russia, and they're not going to take part in any kind of a security architecture. So Trump could try to see if they can work something like that out. They're not going to go for it. Meg says the UK is the worst. Yeah, the UK is another case. Now, what I was saying is that this is different. It's exactly opposite to the way it was during the Cold War, because during the Cold War, it was the Europeans who tended to be much more amenable to the Soviet Union than the Americans were. It was more the Americans who were, aggressive in their attitudes towards the Soviet Union, and particularly in the Reagan era, and but even during even during the 1970s, and whereas the Europeans, particularly with Willy Brandt and Helmut Schmidt, they pursued this Ostpolitik in Germany, and then you also had de Gaulle in the 1960s, who was ignoring all of the pressure that was coming on him from the Americans. and instead we say no. Well, we can work out. We can live with the Soviet Union. This is a great, they're the inheritors of a great civilization, the Russian civilization. They're part of Europe. They'll always be a part of Europe. We can absolutely work with them and form a partnership with them. Absolutely, he was openly defying the Americans. And then you had the Austrians, and those people like Bruno Kreisky, who all wanted to work with the Soviet Union. But now it's reversed. You now have, it's reversed now under Trump, and for the time being. Who knows what will happen after Trump? But at least under Trump, who doesn't have any particular animus towards Russia, he never has. But the Europeans absolutely do. And that's partly because Europe has become transformed because of Europe is now much more dominated by the former communist states, the former members of the Warsaw Pact, and indeed the former republics of the USSR, than the Europe of the 1960s and 70s. Because now you've got the Baltic states, you've got Poland, you've got the Czechs, and everything. So all those people who kind of were members of the Warsaw Pact are now on the other side, and they're weighing down Europe with all of their anger and hatred towards the Russians. So I think it's going to be very difficult to work anything out while they continue to exert their influence. There's the UK. Today was that Rishi Sunak, the former UK Prime Minister, was talking about, again, we have to support Ukraine, including by military means, through military presence, a UK military presence in Ukraine. So he's actually, frothing at the mouth, sending the UK armed forces into Ukraine to fight the Russians. And a lot of people in the UK talk like this. So that's what makes these negotiations particularly difficult. So you can absolutely have a meeting between Trump and Putin, and I think it's going to happen, and I'm sure it'll be quite warm. They seem to like each other, and I think from what Trump has said, he does want to bring this thing to an end. He keeps talking about these young men who are getting killed, and this is senseless. That's shouldn't have happened, and so on. And I think that's genuine, but I don't think he's figured out how it can be brought to an end. Because I think his instinct will be, well, let's just freeze the conflict. Let's just have an armistice. Let's just stop the shooting. That's what Viktor Orban is saying. Orban is also that's his position. Let's have an armistice now, and then let's have the negotiations down the road. But the problem is, if you have an armistice now, I don't see Russia gets anything. The killing stops, true, but then if you have the if the killing stops, Russia hasn't secured the oblasts. It's still there's going to be a good part of that. It still will be under Ukrainian control, and that means that under any circumstances, under any ceasefire circumstances, Ukraine will be replenishing its forces. So while it's pushing the Ukrainians out now, slowly, inch by inch, it's pushing them out. If there's a ceasefire, Ukraine will immediately start replenishing its forces in the oblasts. So that doesn't really work. And then you say, well, okay, well, what about the security, the big security partnership, the big conference? I don't think that's going to work either. As I say, I don't think Trump will find any partners for that. They're not going to take part in any conference with the Russians. Or if they did, they're just simply going to start ranting and raving against Russia. This will not be Helsinki. I don't see any mood for Helsinki in Europe today. Mark says Russia will not agree to a ceasefire. I don't look. But the problem for Russia is this: that Russia will not agree to a ceasefire. Okay. If they don't agree to a ceasefire, if they continue fighting, and continue their their slow inch by inch progress, then they're running a serious risk, and the risk is that they're going to piss Trump off, because then Trump is going to turn around and say, "Well, hey, I went out on a limb. I really wanted to work something out with the Russians. I want to bring this war to an end. I was ready to do a deal, and now the Russians have resumed the fighting, or not. I shouldn't say resume, because they're not going to stop. But the Russians are continuing to fight. They've shown me the back of their hand, and then there's the danger Trump will escalate. And I think Trump is somebody who is prepared to take greater risks than Biden was, and that's a danger for Russia. Because why this war is so terrible is not just because of the extent of the killing, which is quite horrific, but there's always the danger of a nuclear war between the United States and Russia. And so if the United States Trump decides that really I'm thoroughly pissed, I wanted this peace. Russia has shown me the back of their hand. I'm going to escalate. I'm going to really start leaning on Russia. Now, everyone will then say, the response is either, Trump is going to walk away. Trump's going to walk away. He's going to say, it's Biden's war, it's going to walk away. Trump has given no indication he intends to walk away. That's the first thing I have to say. All the things that he has said in the last few days, despite all the hysteria in the media, he has not given any indication that he intends to walk away. Pete Hegseth said simply, he just made explicit what was already implicit. He said that NATO membership for Ukraine will not be part of the negotiated outcome. Well, everyone knew this. I mean, there's nothing new about that. I mean, yeah, of course, it's not going to be part of negotiated outcome. That's way down the road. So that wasn't anything exciting. He said that return to the pre-2014 borders is unrealistic. Well, again, that everyone knew this. Crimea, at the very least, that's all he said. Crimea is not going to return to Ukraine. He didn't even talk about any of the other territories. He just said Crimea is obviously not going to return to Ukraine. Again, Hegseth simply made explicit what was implicit in NATO's approach. And then he said, well, we can have we'll have the security guarantees, which is of course left very vague. Because again, security guarantees, what are they? And that would involve, again, the European powers with their security guarantees. And again, it's a real problem. Even if it's just the Europeans and not the Americans. I mean, the Europeans are just so hostile towards Russia that that it's clearly absolutely unacceptable for the Russians to accept any kind of European presence in Ukraine. But Hegseth talked about that, but said there will be no Americans boots on the ground, though he left open the possibility that Americans might provide air support, Americans might provide anti-missile defenses, or logistical support. He just said there'll be no American boots on the ground, but that still leaves open what kind of support America is prepared to provide. And then he said that somehow that Article 5 will not apply to any. It would have to be any presence of peacekeepers, any presence of peacekeepers will not be under NATO auspices. So in other words, no Article 5 invocation. But again, that's nothing too dramatic, because obviously Article 5 doesn't apply because it's an out of area operation, and Article 5 only applies if a NATO member comes under attack, on its territory. Just simply, a French soldier getting shot somewhere. You can't just simply say, oh, French soldier shot in the Ivory Coast. That you can't invoke Article 5. So Article 5 wouldn't. So Hexa didn't really say anything so startling. So I'm just saying this because I don't. Again, there's a lot of, particularly on this. The Xenon crowd is that Trump is going to walk away. Remember, Trump also said during that lengthy news conference he gave in the Oval Office that he will continue to supply aid to Ukraine. He said he's going to supply aid to Ukraine, but this aid will be secured by this whopping great mineral reserves that the United States is going to get its hands on. This $500 billion worth of reserves that the Americans intend to exploit. And, whether they can or can't, I mean, people are arguing about this, but they don't really know anything about it. Trump believes that they can get their hands on that. And I think that's all that matters, that Trump believes that there are minerals and rare earths that America can get its hands on, and that they would use that as collateral for all the aid that they're going to go on providing Ukraine. And if they think about these minerals, all this titanium and lithium, and they think, whoa, if Ukraine loses the war, then the Russians get their hands on this titanium and lithium, and that means the Chinese get their hands on this titanium and lithium, and Trump's not going to tolerate that. So I don't think Trump's going to walk away from Ukraine. And the other thing is when the Xenon says, "Oh well, America has got nothing left in the cupboard," and so Trump may threaten to escalate, but he can't do it because there's nothing left in the cupboard. I can assure you that America has plenty in the cupboard, and America can do all sorts of things to escalate. Doesn't mean it'll be successful. I'm not saying it's going to succeed, but it's something. It's going to could well raise this war up a few notches and make it even more dangerous than it is. So that's why my view is that nothing much changes as such, other than the tone is different, which is a very good thing. All the moralism and and so on that is gone. That's great. Talking to the Russians, fantastic, good. Very, very good. Fred Case says, "What if the rare earth minerals don't exist or controlled by the Russian Federation?" Well, that's a possibility. Or, exactly. No one really knows exactly how much of the rare earths there are. How much is under the control of the Ukrainian government? How much is under Russian control? Nobody really knows. I mean, people are pretending that they know. They don't know. Suddenly everybody's a geologist. I mean, but what's important is that Trump believes that there are rare earth and minerals in Ukraine. That's what matters. Whether he's right or not, that's what matters. That matters. And there are all sorts of investors, wandering around, with Trump and saying, "Yeah, hey, we can make a ton of money here. Just we got to get our hands on it." Like, Ron Lauder, who's the heir to the Estee Lauder fortune. He's interested in all that. So there are people who are interested in exploiting it. Again, may not happen, and who the hell knows how feasible it is. However, the whole idea that that they don't exist, or Russians have it, and people who are saying it don't know about it. I don't know about it. But what matters is that Trump has figured out a way that he can go on providing aid to Ukraine and getting paid for it. That's all that he wanted. Hey, I can go on providing aid to Ukraine, and we're not out of pocket. That's his mentality. So, for these reasons, I don't think anything very much changes unless Russia makes some very dramatic concessions. And I don't see Russia doing it. I don't see any incentive for Russia to make any real concessions. For Russia to cease fighting now would be a failure. I mean, Russia would have then essentially lost this war. Now, the other side of it would be to say, well, yeah, but Ukraine's on the brink of collapse, and therefore, Ukraine will collapse, and the Western position will be no more, and Russia will just walk off with all of its winnings. Well, first of all, I'd say we've been hearing about the imminent Ukrainian collapse for 3 years. Hasn't happened. I haven't seen any evidence that it's imminent. But even if it did happen, that doesn't solve Russia's problems. Because if there were a Ukrainian collapse, I think that would be the moment for a direct NATO intervention in Ukraine to prevent Russians crossing the Dnieper River. The Western powers are not going to allow Russia to move forward into Kiev and into the West. I think at that moment they would, particularly with Trump, they would simply, they would just move in. If it really happened, Ukraine is just collapsing. They would just move in and say, thus far and no further. We'll accept you up to the Dnieper River, but not 1 inch to the west of that. So even if Ukraine will collapse, I don't think that would lead to the Russians marching into Kiev. Anyway, let's take a look at our our gagglers on the the locals page. The people who keep the dogs happy. Keep the dogs away from me, because they're getting really. It's very, very, very difficult dealing with them. I mean, they're always unhappy. It's like there's a reason why we talk about the Baltic Chihuahuas. I mean, that's what they're like. They're just ferocious. They're always unhappy about the tip jar, and then they blame me for it, and it's very, very hard. Anyway, so let me just have all the way right to the beginning. Yeah. So Stone River, thank you very much, Stone River. Really appreciate it. It says, U.S. proposal via Hexeth, note the lawyerly language, can be read as temporary ceasefire, yes. Western boots on the ground in Ukraine backed by U.S., okay. Massive ramp up in NATO military spending. Door still open for future Ukraine membership of NATO. No security guarantees for Russia. I think I agree with all of that. I mean, I do think that's what it amounts to. So contrary to the excited talk about how this is a game changer, that's probably what it amounts to, because Hexeth talks about this massive increase. Now he says 5%, which is a nutty number, but he puts that forward as a demand. say, okay, well, get it up to at least 3%, get it up to 3.5%. And then it'll become a very militarized Europe. If you start each state starts spending 3.5%, 4% of its GDP on the military, it'd be kind of interesting because that would be a serious threat to Russia, because then it'll be a really militarized Europe. I mean, Europe had not spent that kind of money on its armed forces during the Cold War. So with everybody, if the Americans also push for 5% of GDP on the military, suddenly you have a really militarized NATO and a really militarized Europe, and that's a real threat to Russia. It's an even bigger threat than NATO was before February 2022. So all this talk, this is no peace dividend talk. This is no, oh well, let's focus on our domestic problems, the kind of thing that we might have expected from Trump and America first. We need to address all our domestic inadequacies, our industry stagnating and whatever. No, this is a militarization. This goes way beyond anything we saw in the Cold War. Because if they go up to 5%, then you're looking back. Well, when was it last 5%? The height of the Cold War. And when you're spending that much, and the Europeans are going to be spending that much, then things get quite dangerous. Particularly, this is what I was saying earlier. Particularly if the level of hostility towards Russia will be unabated, and there's no prospect that the hatred towards Russia is likely to diminish any time in the near future. So that makes things quite dangerous. And again, what you said here about the door still open for future Ukraine membership of NATO, I agree with that. Hegseth only said NATO membership for Ukraine will not be part of any negotiated outcome. He didn't say Ukraine will never be in NATO. He said it's not going to be part of a negotiated outcome. Again, everyone got very hysterical because they've been waiting for, Trump's going to sell out, Trump's going to betray Ukraine, he's going to sell out Ukraine, Trump's going to push Ukraine under the bus and so on, because they were waiting for this. But they didn't listen carefully either to what Trump said or to what Hegseth said. He didn't say Ukraine will not be a member of NATO. He said it's not going to be part of a negotiated outcome, which we've already known. I mean, essentially this had always been the position, even of the Biden administration, that's not going to be part of the settlement. But down the road, once the war is over, what's to stop Ukraine being a member of NATO, other than if the U.S. administration and NATO made some kind of a written commitment that we will not accept Ukraine into NATO anytime in the next 25 years. I don't see any chance at all of NATO doing that, of the United States doing that. They're not going to make that commitment. And they don't really see any reason for making that commitment, because again, it's Russia that's been doing the fighting. I mean, NATO really hasn't done any fighting. So NATO's in quite a nice position. It's Russia that has been draining itself and losing many lives, and not really accomplishing its goals. I mean, that's kind of the problem, which is that the goals that Russia had set itself in February 22 just still have not been accomplished. So why would the United States or NATO make this commitment? Ukraine will never be a member of NATO. Why should they? What's the reason for that? They would only make that commitment if NATO had been losing lives, if NATO had been being drained of resources. But that hasn't happened. So if you haven't lost the war, then I don't see any reason to make these kinds of concessions. It's the same thing with the oblasts. That the get to take all the entirety of the four oblasts and accept them as part of the Russian Federation. Well, Russia hasn't done it. Russia hasn't secured the four oblasts. Why should Trump give it to them? Why should he do that? I mean, if you're Trump, why would you want to do that? It doesn't make any sense. So there's that. And again, yeah, I agree with you. Temporary ceasefire, Western boots on the ground. Again, Hegseth did talk about that, except that they would not be U.S. boots, but he left open U.S. support, U.S. logistics support, U.S. air support, anti-missile defenses. So again, U.S. armaments. There's nothing about that U.S. would not provide weaponry to European peacekeepers. So all of that absolutely it's a probability. So a lot of hysteria, but people aren't really looking at the at the reality of what Hegseth actually said, what Trump said. So anyway, thank you very much, Stone River. And Kick 567 says it's basically kabuki theater and smoke and mirrors. Yeah, I agree. Marty always has a good idea. He says film night theme suggestion: the art of the deal, finance and big business. Okay, I like that. The art of the deal, finance and big business. Yeah, it's funny. I mean, there've been a number of movies made like that in recent years about Wall Street, The Big Short, and all that, which I don't find all that. I don't find those films particularly interesting, though some of them are. I think like Wall Street, the Oliver Stone film was, I think, pretty decent. But in the 1950s, they made some movies like that. Executive Suite. That had Barbara Stanwyck. It was an all-star thing with William Holden and so on. It was at the time when there was a certain fascination between corporations and big business, and so Hollywood kind of was fascinated. I mean, on the one hand, he was repelled by big business, but also fascinated by it. So yeah, that's not a. I think that's a good. You would finance and big business for movies. Okay. All right. Thank you, Marty. I like that suggestion. And then Stone River. Thank you so much. Stone River says, it's the first time I've heard Trump say it was Biden trying to bring Ukraine into NATO that caused the war. Yeah, I heard that as well. And he said things like that before. Right? I don't think it's the first time. He has said that before, and then he quickly says, yeah, but it was also Biden saying that he wouldn't mind a small incursion into Ukraine. And it was also Biden with his terrible withdrawal from Afghanistan, that these were the things that triggered Putin. So he's kind of lists these things, but because he puts those other things in, like, Biden saying that he wouldn't mind the small incursion, or Biden and the Afghanistan, and then he's also brought up that it was because Biden ended my sanctions against Nord Stream. That because once he lifted the sanctions on Nord Stream, Putin knew he could make lots of money on gas, and that's why he launched it. So he puts all these things forward, trying to blame Biden. But I don't know whether he really has entirely figured out that it's the NATO membership that's the sticking point. And again, I think it still raises the question: well, what do you do with it? Even if Trump were to accept that that's the issue, I just don't see a Helsinki 2.0. I find it hard to envisage anything like that. I mean, there's just such rabid hatred for Russia in Europe. They're not going to take part in anything like that. I mean, we're going to have new government in Germany, I think, on February the 23rd, so Sunday week. It's going to be more anti-Russian than the Sergeant Schultz's. So it's going to be hard to see how you could in any way negotiate on those two draft treaties that Russia had presented back in December 2021. So again, while Trump maybe would himself might be sympathetic to something along those lines, but no one else is. Anyway, thank you, Stone River. Marx 2023 says, George, a giant schnauzer. I like schnauzers, and I also like the word schnauzer. It's just because it just sounds so German. Schnauzer. George, a giant schnauzer won the best in the show, in the most prestigious dog show in America. They had a chef cook him a Wagyu steak. I was thinking about Peter telling you about his steak night in Moscow. I just hope, for your sake, that the dogs find out. The dogs don't find out. Yeah, that's right. It's it's kind of is interesting that how owners. I mean, Peter actually said that he really didn't give the good steaks to his dogs until he's pretty much finished with the leftovers himself, and then it was the leftovers of the leftovers, which I respect. I do have difficulties whenever I see in restaurants dog owners really giving their dogs, good food, the restaurant food. So the restaurant prepares you a steak, and then they just all cut pieces of the steak and just give them to the dogs. I mean, it's their steak and it's their dogs, but it does seem there's something about it that seems objectionable, that good, expensive food is being given to dogs. I mean, humans, there's plenty of hungry humans, or even not so hungry humans, who would like to eat good food. So you're not giving it to humans; you're giving it to dogs. To me, that's objectionable. But I think, as you point out, that for the dogs, they say, yeah, that's exactly what you need to be doing. You get your good steak, from a very fancy restaurant. You cut it up, and then you give it to the dogs. That's exactly the way it should be. So for them, that's the perfectly reasonable solution, which is why the dogs and I are often at loggerheads. We don't see eye to eye, because I don't think, it's this is one of the many issues on which we have difficulties, along with the tip jar. But whether they deserve the best steaks being cooked in Moscow, that's another issue. Anyway, thank you, Marks 2023. Marty, good to see you. Thanks for the film suggestion. Happy Thursday, George and Gagglers. Thank you. And then Robert says, this is obviously the message from earlier. Maybe George can weigh in on the interpretation of the Trump-Putin call. I think we talked about that, suggesting that Trump is ready to drop the pursuit of U.S. hegemony in preference for rebuilding the U.S. economy. I don't see it. I mean, if you're talking about increasing your military spending to 5% of GDP, this is going all the way back to the Kennedy years, the years of the 1960s. 5% of GDP. This is the time when you were spending all that money on Vietnam. I don't know how you deal with all your other problems, because then obviously you're just running up the huge deficit and all that entails. Because of huge deficit, somehow you have to finance the huge deficit, and that the burden of financing it becomes itself a greater and greater slice of the budget and the budget deficit. But you're also not really focusing on rebuilding the U.S. economy, even from all the tariffs. I don't think he's going to raise enough tariffs to take care of this huge increase in military expenditure. And it's not clear to me, why is he doing this? I mean, if what who against whom will this military be directed? Um, he seems to want good relations with Russia, so it's against China. But China doesn't pose a military threat. I mean, it's ridiculous to even talk about the Chinese military threat. I mean, China does pose a threat of sorts, but it's an economic, a financial threat. But China is just not a serious military power. I mean, it's just and doesn't really do anything that one can even interpret as aggressive military activities. I mean, it hasn't done anything about Taiwan, even though legally it would be entitled to do so. I mean, Taiwan is a part of China. And people keep talking about China's threat to Taiwan and so on, but they never seem to accept Taiwan has since 1972, since the Shanghai Communique with Nixon. Taiwan has been accepted as part of the sovereign territory of China, that it belongs to China. So it's hard to say, and China hasn't even done that. China hasn't tried to use force to fully integrate Taiwan. So again, if you're going to raise this huge military expenditure, then you have to ask, against whom? What's your goal here? And to be honest, NATO is very happy with this because I mean, the NATO member states, they may not like the idea of coughing up this amount of money, but since they are so filled with hatred against Russia, it might not be such a problem for them, to say, okay. I mean, it doesn't mean anything, of course. I mean, 5% of the GDP of Estonia is nothing. I mean, 5% of nothing is nothing. But by this kind of talk, Trump is simply ginning up NATO militarism. And again, it's hard to see how NATO militarism, European militarism, the militarization of the European continent, which is what Trump and Hexeth are now talking about, it's hard to see how that's going to help anybody. How's that going to bring peace? How's it going to make it, this kind of stability for Russia? I mean, it's not at all compatible with any kind of Helsinki 2.0, where that was part of a détente and part of easing of tensions. This isn't the easing of tensions. This is exacerbating tensions, and Trump is talking about essentially exacerbating tensions. On the one hand, he's talking about how, we're going to have this meeting with Putin, Saudi Arabia, it's going to be great and whatever. And at the same time, he's exacerbating tensions. And they're not doing what you're saying, suggesting that Trump is ready to drop the pursuit of U.S. hegemony in preference for rebuilding U.S. economy. He's not at all in the business of abandoning the pursuit of U.S. hegemony, because with all the talk about the Panama Canal, which Trump is now determined to take back, I imagine he will. Taking Greenland, he is going to do it. I'm sure that's going to happen. I think he's going to lean on the countries in the Western Hemisphere much more heavily than he's already done so. This is part of his goal of hegemony. And I think to take on China, and so it seems like the plan he has in mind is the militarization of the European continent. Let the Europeans contain Russia with will be militarily much stronger. They're going to take care of Russia. Ultimately, they'll still be the nuclear umbrella, the American nuclear umbrella, but now the Europeans will have more armed forces at their disposal. But the ultimate force of resort, the force of last resort will be the United States because of its nuclear weapons, but the Europeans will provide the military manpower and the hardware, and in the meantime, the Americans will direct their armed forces against China. This is a militarization. This is a global militarization. This isn't anything to do with taking care of your domestic industries. I mean, that's as far as I can see, that's the Trump plan. I mean, I'm not at all sure it's workable, but that seems to be the Trump plan. It's not at all. Well, hey, let's give up U.S. hegemony and let's focus on our domestic problems. I don't, you know, just I'd say that. So it's in fact the opposite of that. So says and then anyway Robert goes on. For instance, dropping sanctions on Russia drives down energy costs, tamping down inflation, while ending the urgency for a dollar substitute acting to strengthen the dollar. Well, first of all, I'm not sure that he will drop sanctions on Russia, and particularly if, as I suspect, the ceasefire is not going to gel. I don't think the Russians will accept a ceasefire because I say if they accept a ceasefire, then they will have failed, and they will have seen to be failed, and that would be a humiliation for Russia. So I think they will go on, in their plodding way, trying to take these 4 oblasts. But in those circumstances, I think Trump will escalate and then will tighten the sanctions. I mean, I think you can always tighten the sanctions. The tightening the sanctions will, of course, raise energy prices. So on the one hand, Trump wants to increase energy production in order to lower prices. But if you tighten sanctions, which I think you will also want to do, then you're going to raise prices. I mean, Trump has these contradictory policies. It's like he wants a strong dollar, but at the same time he wants Jerome Powell, the Fed chair, to lower interest rates. Well, if you lower interest rates, then you get a weaker dollar. And the same with you want to have you want to be the manufacturing powerhouse, but if you have a strong dollar, then that makes imports cheaper. I mean, so everyone will be happy. Yeah, sure. Yeah, let's have a strong dollar. But then that means it'll make other countries' exports more competitive in the American market. But anyway, that's the interesting part of Trump's economic policy. Anyway, where was I? Then Laura Oat says Kellogg mentioned today about the 4 oblasts that a solution would be to recognize them as dominated by Russia, but not as an integral part of the Russian territories. Well, I guess, but I don't think it matters too much what the West recognizes. It's more a question of, well, what can Russia do? I mean, if Russia is not in control of the oblasts, then Russia still has a problem on its hand, because essentially it's still, those oblasts that it claims are part of the Russian Federation, therefore Russian territory. That means there will still be Ukrainian armed forces on Russian territory, and therefore Russia is not in control of its own territory, and that's a problem. So if Russia were to have driven out the Ukrainian forces, then at least we could deal with that, and we can say, and then the Kellogg solution, well, dominated by Russia, but not an integral part of Russian territories, then that makes sense. Okay, well, you don't have to recognize it. It's just it becomes a reality, like the Baltic states. You don't have to recognize they're part of the Soviet Union, but you just accept it as the reality. But in this case, it's not really part of the reality, and that's why it's difficult to see how Russia can stop the fighting. It's as long as you don't control that, then you have to you have to continue, because then you say, well, what have you accomplished? They're not, you haven't, you've said they're part of your the Russian territory, but they're not. So that's why I think that this is this is going to be the problem that Russia is going to face, and why I think this ceasefire idea isn't going to work. And then Robert says, here's a few quid to help the hounds carry out their special monetary operation on the tip jar. Thank you so much, Robert. I think they're going to, their special monetary operation will probably be more ruthlessly executed than Russia's special military operation. I think they're going to go in all in. Without worrying about their Western partners, they're not going to worry about me as their partner. They just take whatever's there, and let others live with the consequences. So, but anyway, thank you so much, Robert. Marx 2023 says, in 4 years, the mighty Red Army liberated Russia, Ukraine, all of Eastern Europe, and marched into Berlin. Russia, after 3 years, has still not crossed the river Dnieper. Well, I can't disagree with any of that. I think that's why it's a problem. I mean, it's 3 years. So if it's 3 years, June 1941, which is the start of Operation Barbarossa, and then where were we June 1944? And you think, wow, by June 1944, the Red Army was already fighting outside of the borders of the USSR. It was already liberating the territories of Romania and Bulgaria. It was liberating Poland, and on the brink of its massive offensive into Germany. So that's where it was after 3 years. Germany had essentially already been defeated within the USSR. The Red Army was now moving down and liberating Eastern Europe, moving towards liberating the Balkans, and as I was saying earlier, already entering Hungary and ready to lay siege to Budapest. So you're right. Anne-Marie, very good to see you. Thank you so much for your generosity. And I should say, Anne-Marie has very, very generously posted a musical treat for us, something that she performed for Julian Assange. It's on our locals page, and it's really beautiful playing. She plays the violin, and she has a pianist with her. And there's 2 pieces of music, Tchaikovsky and Massenet, and it's just absolutely gorgeous. It's brings tears to your eyes. So thank you so much, Anne-Marie, for posting this. I urge everybody to listen to this and just to be amazed that we have such a talented musician among us. So thank you so much, Anne-Marie. And if there are any other musical pieces of yours that you can post on our page, absolutely please do so. It's lovely. So it's there. It's pinned on the locals board. So everybody go and just listen to this, really beautiful playing. So thank you so much, Anne-Marie, and thank you for your generosity. Kick 567 project EU left out in the cold. Yes. And then Kick says, J.D. Vance, Red EU, the riot act in France, Van der Crazy face dropped. This is a terrible thing. I mean, the EU sort of is led by these awful people. I don't remember it ever being like this. You've got this von der Leyen, and then you have the Estonian Kaja Kallas, who runs the foreign policy. Then you have the Annalena Baerbock, the German foreign minister, likely to remain German foreign minister in the new government. Mercifully, we don't have the Finn chick with us anymore. She's making a bundle of money working for Tony Blair. I forgot her name, but you know the Finn chick, the one she masterminded Finland's entry into NATO. So it's a really terrible situation in Europe. The worst people have taken over, and I think it's had really deleterious consequences for Europe. Anyway, Marx 2023 says George Trump has a very simple solution for Europe to comply. The energy card will be used now that the EU are dependent on America. Trump will also demand 5% of GDP on defense. He will also use the tariff tax. Yeah, I think that's yeah. I mean, Europe has put itself into this position of complete subservience towards the United States, and it's now getting what it should have known will happen. This was America's war. Europe never should have got itself into this. Back in 2021, you still have Sergeant Schultz and Macron were seen to be kind of having a relatively restrained position on Ukraine. They were pushed by the Americans, the Biden administration, to take ever more radical positions, and now Europe is completely, off the cliff in its lunacy about Ukraine, and they're now tearing their hair out. Well, in the case of Schultz, it's a little hard, but they're tearing their hair out about what Trump has said, even though, as we've discussed today, he hasn't said anything so outlandish. Nothing. He's only made explicit what's already been implicit in NATO negotiations. But they're panicking, and the Europeans are panicking because they've gone out on a limb for no reason at all. They've gone out on a limb on behalf of Ukraine, and now they're terrified of the prospect of the Americans pulling the rug. This is a perennial European obsession, that somehow the Americans are going to pick up their toys and go home. That somehow, the Americans are going to abandon us. We'll be abandoned. What are we going to do? What are we going to do? Americans never really do that. But by panicking like this, by showing how weak and subservient they are, how utterly lacking any will of their own, that only encourages American bullying. I mean, why wouldn't the Americans bully the Europeans? I mean, if the Europeans are so abject, if they see themselves as a doormat, then of course they're going to be treated as a doormat. But as I say, I don't think Trump is going to walk away, and I don't think he's given any indication he's going to walk away. But the panic only strengthens Trump's hand. I mean, he just sees how weak and timid and frightened the Europeans are, and he's going to exploit it. Marx 2020 says Russia will not agree to a ceasefire. I agree with you. I agree. I don't see it either. Kick 567 says President Macron snubbed Narendra Modi, did not shake his hand, cold-blooded, walked right by him at the AI summit in France. I didn't see that. That's interesting. And then Mark says, I also know that many American oil companies are laying off workers, so not good for baby drill. Well, that's always been the problem. I mean, if you say, well, we're going to drive down oil prices, well, I mean, how do the oil companies react to that? I mean, there's a point at which you drive down prices so much through overproduction or overcapacity that it no longer makes any sense to go on producing oil. It makes no sense. You can't, you're not making enough money to reinvest in the industry. It's just you have to make a sufficient profit to be able to reinvest and maintenance and so on. And ensuring that you don't overuse oil fields, and ensure that you're developing new fields and whatever. So it was always, it was very dubious that you can just keep lowering prices, and particularly other countries are going to respond, because if you keep lowering prices, then other countries will just simply stop producing themselves in order to try to raise prices. So but that laying people off, laying workers off is exactly the consequence. If the oil companies are not making enough through oil sales, then they're going to lay people off. So and you say, the drop in profits to Trump's low oil price has no legs. Yeah, I agree. It's not a policy that makes us agree to sense. But as I say, it also goes against the other policy, which is, well, to tighten sanctions against particularly Russian oil sales. So if you're going to tighten sanctions against Russian oil sales, assuming that you can do it, assuming that it'll be successful, that's going to raise oil prices. So it's like, again, the two policies are, work against each other. And Mark says, George, have you noticed the gold price and the volumes of gold leaving London with up to 8 weeks of delay and no new customers defined delivery dates? Yeah, I've noticed. I noticed they're quite interesting. The gold, I think the gold situation, there's a real concern about Trump inflation. I mean, that's already reflected in these dramatic rises, because Trump is planning to spend money. And so on all kinds of things. I mean, you can cut USAID all you want, and I'm not sure they're going to succeed in cutting it entirely. But if you're going to spend all this amount on your military, then you're going to have a real problem with inflation. You can see now that already. That Jerome Powell is raising interest rates, because they've got serious inflationary fears. And of course, when you have inflationary fears, then people move into gold. So, and then George, total nonsense that NATO will enter directly into Ukraine into a direct war with Russia. I don't agree with you there. I think that if Ukraine if Ukraine collapses, NATO will not just stand by and allow it to collapse. That's my point. If that the idea that they're just going to allow Russia to march into Kiev, that's not going to happen. That's they can and then NATO will move in and just essentially say, this is the demarcation line. You don't go any further than that. And I think if you draw up a demarcation line, there's no necessity of a shooting war with Russia, but they'll just make clear, you can go up to the Dnieper, but no further westwards. So that I think that's the case. I don't think they will allow the Western Ukraine just to be taken over by the Russians. And Robert says, I wonder whether Trump's demand for $500 billion worth of Ukrainian rare earth minerals isn't just a negotiating tactic, that he knows Ukraine can't possibly make good on it, in which case Trump now has already excused to abandon Ukraine, which seems to be his preference. I don't know that is his preference. I think the issue of the $500 billion, I mean, it's not going to be clear for some time whether this $500 billion is real or not. I mean, it's something that he can say, hey, we're going to make some money on it. But at this stage, all we're doing is, he thinks, is, we get some investors, we're going to do some geological surveys, we're going to figure out how much it's going to cost to excavate these minerals or these rare earths. that's going to take time. That's not something you're going to do it and then work out a schedule. But in the meantime, he's going to use this the 500 billion as collateral. He'll say, look, well, clearly investors are really interested in this, and we got to, this is a project. We're getting it off the ground. Is using it as collateral. That's what he's doing right now. He's saying this rare earth, we can use that as collateral. So we're giving you this money, but we're securing it with this the collateral that we're going to recoup at some later date. But it's not going to happen right now. But it's important for Trump in that he can make it seem as if, hey, we're making money on this, we're not losing money. But the question, I think, does he want to abandon Ukraine? I don't see it. I really don't see it. I think he wants the war to end, but he hasn't quite figured out how to end it. But and he probably, he may well not like Zelensky on a personal level. I don't think he just wants to abandon Ukraine. I just don't. I don't see any evidence for that. But he does. He wants to make it seem as if, oh, we're making money on this. It's like, as he said about Iraq. Hey, we should have taken the oil. If we're going to do all this for Iraq, send in our forces and invade him, liberate them from Saddam Hussein, we should have taken their oil. So I think that's the mentality. But in terms of, will this $500 billion ever materialize? Well, I don't know. But Trump thinks that it will. And even Scott Bessent, probably Scott Bessent, he's not a, he's also kind of a shrewd businessman, made a lot of money in his life, a very, very rich man, a billionaire. He signed some kind of a document. I don't know whether he takes this seriously or not. I don't know, but he signed a document about, hey, hand over all these your mineral deposits to us. So one has to, if these people are taking it seriously, I think we should take it seriously. And so I think that it's a way of continuing to fund Ukraine. By the time we find out that there's nothing there, or it's going to cost more to excavate this minerals than any possible revenue. By that time, we'll all be long gone. It's not going to be decided in the next few days. And yes, where are we? Yeah. Oh, now I've lost where I was. This always happens. Yeah. Mark says, George, the tariffs are a smokescreen for the tax breaks for the rich that Trump will deliver, keeping himself in mind. Yeah, well, okay. President Putin said last week that the Trumpster will get all the chihuahuas in the EU and UK lined up, waving their tails like good little puppies. Yeah. And then J.D. Vance set the US-EU straight yesterday, says kick thing. Anne Marie, thank you again, Anne Marie, for your generosity. Thank you for that beautiful music. It's a real treat for all of us. Yeah. That's the one. Sanna Marin, the Finland, the Finn chick. And then here we have Marty says, tick them off. Who are these people? Boris Johnson and everyone. There's puppets in Gonzalo Lira. Oh, I forgot about him. Gonzalo Lira sent this tweet out. Puppets in positions of leadership who have no actual power. So there's that 2022. So Biden gone, Zelensky was still there for the time being. Boris Johnson gone, Macron there. Scholz, he'll be gone soon. Von der Leyen, she's still there. Kamala. I read somewhere that she's planning to run for governor of California. I don't know. Big mistake. I think she should lie low for a while, not run for office. we remember what happened with Nixon. Nixon lost when he tried that, lost in 1960 to Kennedy, and then he ran in 62 for the governor of California, which he lost. And that, under normal circumstances, would have been the end of his political career. It's just that after the Goldwater debacle, he was able to come back. But if Kamala, after the humiliation of the presidential election, and then she loses in the race for governor of California, I think that would be the end for her. I can't see her recovering. So I think it would be a mistake for her to jump in and seek elective office now. Anyway, Trudeau, he's gone. Arden, gone. Morrison, Scott Morrison, wow. Wow, I'd forgotten about him. But anyway, he's gone mercifully. Sanna Marin making a ton of money with Tony Blair. Morawiecki gone. I guess he could come back. Shabbat Sharif, Pakistan, okay, and Kishida, Japan. All right, so this is a very mediocre crew, to say the least. But anyway, Marty, thank you for the suggestion for the next film poll, The Art of the Deal, Big Finance and Business and Cinema. I like that. That's, yeah. And so, but anyway, my time is up. And so thank you, everybody who joined me. Thank you so much for all of your questions and the challenges, your insights and observations. Thank you for, above all, to those who have put something into the tip jar. They're talking about the schnauzer and, getting that I think is going to get the dogs a bit excited when they read about the schnauzer and so why then they're not getting the kind of generous steak dinners that the schnauzer is getting. So, but it's my burden to have to answer to them. But anyway, thank you so much for contributing to the tip jar. This weekend we're going to do the the usual podcast, and then we're going to do live stream on Monday with Peter, and then Tuesday I'm going to do my solo at the usual time. So hope to see you then. Until then, have a good night, and see you very soon. All the best. Bye-bye.